Kill a Mockingbird, Reader's Digest version, Chapter 7, Part 1. Maycomb was interested by the news of Tom's death for perhaps 2 days. "Did you hear about? They say he was running fit to beat lightning." To Maycomb, Tom's death was typical. Typical of him to cut and run. Typical of black man's mentality to have just run blind first chance he saw. A few more details enabling the listener to repeat his version in turn. Then nothing to talk about until the Maycomb Tribune editorial appeared the following Thursday. Mr. B.B. Underwood was at his most bitter, and he couldn't have cared less who canceled advertising and subscriptions. But Maycomb didn't play that way. Mr. Underwood could holler and write whatever he wanted to. He'd still get his advertising and subscriptions. If he wanted to make a fool of himself in his paper, that was his business. Mr. Underwood didn't talk about miscarriage of justice. He simply figured it was a sin to kill cripples, be they standing, sitting, or escaping. He likened Tom's death to the senseless slaughter of songbirds by hunters and children, and Maycomb thought he was trying to write an editorial poetical enough to be reprinted in the Montgomery Advisor. Senseless killing when Tom had been given due process of law? But Mr. Underwood's meaning was clear. In the secret courts of men's hearts, Atticus had no case. Tom was a dead man the minute Mayella Ewell opened her mouth and screamed. The name Ewell gave me a queasy feeling. Miss Stephanie told Aunt Alexandra in Jim's presence, "Oh, Foot, he's old enough to listen," that Mr. Ewell said it made 1 down and 2 more to go. He meant Atticus and Judge Taylor. Jim told me not to be afraid. Mr. Ewell was more hot gas than anything. Meanwhile, September came and Dill left us. School started, and so did our daily trips past the Radley place. Jim was in the 7th grade and went to high school beyond the grammar school building. I was now in the 3rd grade. Jim went out for football, but was too slender and too young yet to do anything but carry the team water buckets. This he did with enthusiasm. He was seldom home before dark. The Radley place had ceased to terrify me, but it was no less gloomy, no less chilly under its great oaks. We knew Boo was there for the same old reason. Nobody'd seen him carried out yet. I sometimes felt a twinge of remorse at having taken part in what must have been torment to Arthur Radley. What reasonable recluse wants children delivering greetings on the end of a fishing pole, wandering in his collards at night? And yet I remembered 2 Indian head pennies, soap dolls, a broken watch. I stopped and looked at the tree one afternoon. The trunk was swelling around its cement patch. "You aren't starting that again, are you?" said Atticus, when I expressed a desire to have just one good look at Boo Radley before I died. "If you are, I'll tell you right now, stop it. You know Mr. Nathan shoots at every shadow he sees. You were lucky not to have been killed." I hushed then and there. So many things had been happening to us anyway that Boo Radley was the least of our fears. Atticus said that things had a way of settling down, and after enough time passed, people would forget Tom Robinson. Perhaps he was right, but the events of the summer hung over us that September like smoke in a closed room. Apparently, the attitude of the adults in Maycomb was that neither Jim nor I could help having Atticus for a parent, so their children must be nice to us in spite of him. Had our classmates been left to their own devices, Jim and I would have had several satisfying fistfights and ended the matter for good. As it was, we were compelled to hold our heads high and be, respectfully, a gentleman and a lady. One odd thing that fall I never understood. In spite of Atticus's shortcomings, people re-elected him to the state legislature. I came to the conclusion that people were just peculiar. Gradually, things did settle down, after a fashion, as Atticus said they would. By the middle of October, only 3 small things out of the ordinary had happened to 3 Maycomb citizens. The first thing was that Mr. Bob Ewell acquired and lost a job in a matter of days. He was the only man I ever heard of who was fired from the WPA for laziness. Thereafter, muttering, he resumed his regular weekly appearances at the welfare office for his check. The welfare lady said Mr. Ewell openly accused Atticus of getting him fired. The second thing happened to Judge Taylor. Judge Taylor was not a Sunday night churchgoer. Mrs. Taylor was. Church time found Judge Taylor holed up in his study reading. One Sunday night, Judge Taylor's attention was wrenched from his reading by a scratching noise. "Hush," he said to Ann Taylor, his fat, nondescript dog. Then he realized he was speaking to an empty room. The noise was coming from the rear of the house. Judge Taylor clumped to the back porch to let Ann out and found the screen door swinging open. A shadow on the corner of the house caught his eye, and that was all he saw of his visitor. Miss Taylor came home from church to find her husband in his chair, lost in reading again, with a shotgun across his lap. Atticus guessed the prowler had been Bob Ewell. The third thing happened to Helen Robinson, Tom's widow. Tom had not been forgotten by his employer, Mr. Link Diaz, who made a job for Helen as his cook. Calpurnia said it was hard on Helen because she had to walk nearly a mile out of her way to avoid the Ewells, who, according to Helen, chunked at her the first time she tried to use the public road. Mr. Link Diaz eventually realized that Helen was coming to work each morning from the wrong direction and dragged the reason out of her. That afternoon, he walked Helen home. On his way back, he stopped at the Ewell's gate. "Ewell," he called. "I say, Ewell." The windows, normally packed with children, were empty. "I know you're in there. Now hear me, Bob Ewell. If I hear one more peep out of my girl Helen about not being able to walk this road, I'll have you in jail before sundown." Mr. Link spat in the dust and walked home. Helen went to work next morning and used the public road. Nobody chunked at her, but when she was a few yards beyond the Ewell house, she looked around and saw Mr. Ewell walking behind her. She walked on, and all the way to Link Diaz's house, she heard a soft voice behind her crooning foul words. Thoroughly frightened, she telephoned Mr. Link at his store. Mr. Link came home and found Mr. Ewell leaning on the fence. "Ewell," he said, "get your stinking carcass off my fence, and stay away from my cook or I'll have you up for assault." "I ain't touched her, Link Diaz." "You don't have to touch her. All you have to do is make her afraid, and I'll get you in on the ladies' law. If you don't think I mean it, just bother that girl again." Mr. Ewell evidently thought he meant it, for Helen reported no further trouble. "Atticus, I don't like it at all," was Aunt Alexandra's assessment of these events. "That man seems to have a permanent running grudge against everybody connected with that case." "Well," said Atticus, "he's had his fling with about everybody now, so we ought to be satisfied. He'll settle down when the weather changes." By the end of October, our lives had become the familiar routine of school, play, study. Maycomb was itself again, precisely the same as last year and the year before that, with only two minor changes. Firstly, people had removed from their store windows and automobiles the stickers that said, "NRA, we do our part." I asked Atticus why, and he said because the National Recovery Act was dead. I asked who killed it, and he said 9 old men. The second change in Maycomb was not one of national significance. Until that fall, Halloween had been a completely unorganized affair. Each child did what he wanted to do, with assistance from other children if there was anything heavy to be moved. But when last year a light buggy was placed on top of the livery stable, parents thought things were going too far. It was decided that this year the high school auditorium would be open. There would be a pageant, apple bobbing, and taffy pulling. There would also be a prize of 25 cents for the best Halloween costume. Jim and I both groaned. Not that we'd ever done anything, it was the principle of the thing. I soon learned, too, that my services would be required on stage that evening. Miss Grace Merriweather had composed an original pageant, and she thought it would be adorable if some of the children were costumed to represent the county's agricultural products. Cecil Jacobs would be a cow, Agnes Boone would make a lovely butterbean, another child would be a peanut, and so on down the line. I was to be a ham. Our only duties were to enter from stage left as Miss Merriweather, not only the author, but the narrator, identified us. When she called out pork, that was my cue. Then the assembled company would sing Maycomb County, Will I Be True to Thee, as the finale. And Miss Merriweather would mount the stage with the state flag. Ms. Crenshaw, the local seamstress, bent some chicken wire into the shape of a ham for me. She covered it with brown cloth, leaving 2 peepholes, and painted it. When the contraption was pulled down over my head, it came almost to my knees. Jim said I looked exactly like a ham with legs. But the costume was hot. It was a close fit, and once inside, I could not get out of it alone. When Halloween came, I assumed that the whole family would be present to watch me perform, but I was disappointed. Aunt Alexandra said she just had to get to bed early. She'd been decorating the stage all afternoon and was worn out. Atticus said, as tactfully as he could, that he just didn't think he could stand a pageant tonight. He was all in from being in Montgomery for a week. He thought Jim might escort me if I asked him. Jim said he would take me, and thus began our longest journey together. The weather was unusually warm for the last day of October. We didn't even need jackets. The wind was growing stronger, and there was no moon. The street light on the corner cast sharp shadows on the Radley house. Jim laughed softly. "Then nobody bothers them tonight," he said. He was gallantly carrying my ham costume, rather awkwardly, as it was hard to hold. "It is a scary place, though, ain't it?" I said. "Boo doesn't mean anybody any harm, but I'm right glad you're along." "You know Atticus wouldn't let you go to the schoolhouse by yourself. That yard's a mighty long place for little girls to cross at night," Jim teased. "Ain't you scared of haunts?" We laughed. Haunts, hot steams, incantations, secret signs had vanished with our years as mist with sunrise. We turned the corner and entered the schoolyard. It was pitch black. "How do you know where we're at, Jim?" I asked when we had gone a few steps. "I can tell we're under the big oak because we're passing through a cool spot. Careful now." We had slowed to a cautious gait and were feeling our way forward so as not to bump into the tree. It was an ancient oak. 2 children could not reach around its trunk and touch hands. It was near the Radley lot, far away from teachers and curious neighbors, and the earth beneath its branches was packed hard for many fights and furtive crap games. "You should have brought the flashlight, Jim," I said. "It didn't look like it'd be this dark early in the evening. So cloudy, that's why." Someone leaped at us. "God almighty!" Jim yelled. A circle of light burst in our faces, and Cecil Jacobs jumped in glee behind it. "Ah, gotcha!" he shrieked. Cecil had ventured down this far because he knew good and well we'd be coming along. He thought Atticus would be with us, though. "Shucks, ain't much but around the corner," said Jim. We had to admit, though, that Cecil had given us a fright. When the 3 of us reached the high school, the whole town, and most of the country, it seemed, were there. The building was teeming with slicked-up country people milling around games, candy booths, and a house of horrors. We visited several booths, and then Miss Merriweather's runners appeared and told Cecil and me to go backstage. The auditorium was filling with people, and the high school band had assembled in front below the stage. The stage footlights were on, and the red velvet curtain rippled and billowed from the scurrying going on behind it. Backstage, the narrow hallway was teeming with adults in homemade 3-cornered hats, Confederate caps, or World War helmets, and children dressed as various agricultural enterprises. Miss Merriweather galloped to me and thrust me inside my chicken wire. "You all right in there, Scout?" asked Cecil. "Yes," I said. "You sound so far off, like you was on the other side of a hill." "You don't sound any nearer," I said. The band played the national anthem, and we heard the audience rise. Then the bass drum sounded. Miss Merriweather, stationed behind her lectern beside the band, said, "Macomb County, ad astra per aspera." The bass drum boomed again. "That means," said Miss Merriweather, translating for the rustic elements, "from the mud to the stars." She added unnecessarily, it seemed to me, "a pageant." The bass drum went on booming with every sentence Miss Merriweather uttered. She chanted mournfully that Macomb County was a part of the Mississippi and Alabama territories, that the first white man to set foot in its virgin forest was the probate judge's great-grandfather 5 times removed, who was never heard of again. Then came the fearless Colonel Macomb, for whom the county was named. Mrs. Merriweather gave a 30-minute description of Colonel Macomb's exploits. I discovered that if I bent my knees, I could tuck them under my costume and more or less sit. I sat down, listened to Miss Merriweather's drone, and was soon fast asleep. They said later that Miss Merriweather was putting her all into the grand finale, that she had crooned "pork" with the confidence born of pine trees and butter beans entering on cue. She waited, then called, "Pork?" When nothing materialized, she yelled, "Pork!" I must have heard her in my sleep, or the band playing Dixie woke me. But it was when Miss Merriweather triumphantly mounted the stage with the state flag that I chose to make my entrance. Chose is incorrect. I thought I'd better catch up with the rest of them. They told me later that Judge Taylor went out behind the auditorium and stood there, slapping his knees so hard Miss Taylor brought him a glass of water and one of his pills. Everybody was cheering, and Miss Merriweather seemed to have a hit, but she caught me backstage and told me I had ruined her pageant. She made me feel awful, but when Jim came to fetch me, he said I did all right. I just came in a little late. Not even Jim could make me face that crowd again, and he consented to wait backstage with me until the audience left. "You want to take your costume off, Scout?" he asked. "No, I'll just keep it on," I said. I could hide my mortification under it. "Not many folks left now," Jim said finally. "Let's go."